A lot of folks wonder if a card scraper can eliminate all the sanding they hate to do. The answer is yes, a scraper can greatly reduce your sanding time if you know how to sharpen and use one properly. A couple weeks ago I made a video that discussed the pros and cons of scrapers compared to sanders and planes. If you're still on the fence about which process is best for you, then I suggest you check out that video at the link in the description below. You'll learn quite a bit. I'll also link to some good quality, reasonably priced scrapers if you want to go that route, and what you need to keep them sharp. But first you have to understand why you must properly sharpen a scraper. A scraper isn't supposed to scrape as much as it is supposed to shave wood fibers. A piece of steel with a square edge can scrape up dust from a board's surface, but you'd be burnishing and compressing the fibers, not shearing them, and you'd be working a lot harder than you need to. A scraper with a properly formed hook along the edge shaves the fibers on the board's surface, removing more material with less effort and leaving a much nicer surface behind. If your scraper doesn't create fluffy shavings, it either needs sharpening or your technique could use some work. So let's cover the sharpening first, then we'll discuss the technique. Now the first step is to square the scraper's edge and remove any nicks or imperfections that are there. This is done with a mill file, not a coarse one. That'll be too aggressive and it'll leave too rough a surface that you'll have to really work to refine. You want a fine single cut mill file that will leave behind a nice surface. Again, I'll link to this stuff below if you need it. I like to color the edge of my scraper with a Sharpie so I know when I've refreshed down its entire length. This usually requires 4 or 5 light passes while holding the file square to the edge. I also like to round over the corners so they aren't so sharp in my hands during use. If you have trouble holding the file freehand, you might make a jig by cutting a slot down the center of a piece of hardwood. By holding the block against the scraper's face, you ensure that the file remains square to the edge. The downside is your file will tend to wear out faster because the work is concentrated right in the center, whereas you may spread out the wear if you work freehand. So at this point, you should feel a rough burr along the edges of the scraper. Now some people will start using it just as soon as they feel the burr, and it will make shavings at that point. But the edge won't last long with such a poorly formed burr, and because it's irregular and jagged, you're likely to leave scratches on the surface of your workpiece that you'll see under finish later. So I prefer to further refine it to establish a proper hook. And the next step is to smooth the edge with a stone. I like diamond stones, but oil stones or water stones will work, or you could even put sandpaper on a flat surface. I suggest 2 grits, something around 220 to 320 and something around 1,000. I like to use my block of wood to keep the card perpendicular to the stone as I work, moving it around to spread out the wear over the entire abrasive surface. I start with the medium grit, which was around 220, and then I check the progress by letting the light catch the edge of the scraper. You'll be able to see any nicks or scratches. It shouldn't take long before all those file marks are gone. Then I wipe the scraper and the stone and my block of wood, especially if I'm using a water stone or sandpaper, because I don't want to move any loose grit over to my 1,000 grit surface. I also like to polish a strip of the card's face right along the edge on either side to remove any other bits of ragged burr that my file may have been left behind. But I don't want to polish the entire face of the card. That would take forever. So I hold a thin steel rule like this one against the surface in the center with my fingers, and I lay that on the stone. Then I use my block of wood to apply pressure right along the edge. So I concentrate all of my efforts there, and this shouldn't take long at all because of that. Remember, each card has 2 long edges that must receive attention during each step of this process. Time spent during these steps will pay off later in a more durable and better performing edge. You spend more time now, you'll spend less time overall. But keep in mind that this part of the process, involving the file and the stone, only is done every 2 or 3 times that you retouch your scraper's edge. The majority of the time, you'll just be forming and reforming a hook with a burnisher, which is the next step I'm going to show you. At this point, you have a square edge with crisp, sharp corners. Now we have to draw out and bend over some steel all along that edge to form a hook on either side. This is done with a burnisher, which is a very hard piece of steel. In the old days, folks may have used screwdrivers or other tools for that purpose, maybe a gouge. But modern scrapers are made from much harder steel than they used to be, while modern screwdrivers are made from cheaper, softer steel, particularly along the unhardened shaft. You'll get best results with a proper burnisher that's made for this purpose. Forming a hook is a two-step process. First, lay the scraper flat and run your burnisher down its length at a very slight angle and with firm pressure. After a few strokes, flip the card over and repeat the process on the opposite side. This has drawn the steel away from the edge. Now we have to fold it over to form a hook. So clamp the scraper in a vise, or you could hold it firmly in your hand. The angle at which you hold the burnisher isn't critical, but you do want to hold that angle consistently as you move the tool along the edge of the scraper. And you want to apply firm pressure. You may even draw the burnisher sideways as you go down its length to pull the steel outward and downward. At this point, you should be able to feel the hook. You could barely catch your fingernails on it. And that hook should run unbroken down the entire length of the edge. Repeat the process on both sides of that edge so you have two usable hooks on each edge of the scraper. Since every card has two long edges, you'll have 4 hooks that you can work with. Now, as these hooks become dull, you can return to the burnisher and reform them using the same two-step process. You don't have to go back to the file and the stone every time. But eventually, as always happens when you bend metal back and forth repeatedly, this hook is going to break off and you will have to go back and work through the file and the stone process again. It's not as much work as you think. You can do a lot of scraping before you go back to the file if you have good card scrapers. That said, I like to prep 3 or 4 or more scrapers at a time so I have plenty of sharp edges that I can go through before I have to stop my work and go back to the sharpening area. Now let's talk about how to use a card scraper. As I said, the term scraping is deceiving because its function is to plane or shear wood fibers. If you aren't getting shavings, if you're mostly getting dust, your scraper either lacks a properly formed edge or you aren't using it correctly. Hold the scraper in 2 hands, pressing the center with your thumbs to create a slight bow. Place it on the workpiece and tilt it at a forward angle. As you push the scraper forward, you can make changes to that angle to achieve the best results. It won't take long until you get a feel for the proper angle and it becomes second nature. Note that the center of the scraper does all the work. The more you bend the card, the narrower the cutting path will be. Use this to your advantage to concentrate your efforts in certain areas of the board, maybe where there's some tear out or other flaw that goes deeper than scratches that might be found elsewhere in the board. But keep in mind that the more you bend the card, the more it will scoop out the wood surface and it could leave an uneven surface. So I like to focus on my problem areas, working with a more aggressive bend at first. Then I blend those scooped areas out by working with a shallower bend and covering the entire surface. This widens my cutting path and will help level the board. Sometimes pulling the card toward my body is easier, especially for less aggressive leveling strokes. Switching between push and pull cuts also helps rest my hands, which can become tired from bending the steel. If your hands tire easily, they make scrapers that are thinner so that they bend easier. The steel will also heat up from friction, and it could become too hot to hold onto. This may be when you just swap to a different scraper while the first one cools. Some people even put those business card size magnets on their scrapers to protect their fingers from the heat. You might buy a scraper holder to save on your hands as well. I'm not a huge fan of holders myself because I like to alter the bend frequently as I work, and I don't like pausing to adjust the mechanism on the holder, but some people really like them. Finally, remember that scraping isn't the best process for every workpiece. They had a form of sandpaper in the old-timey days as well as scrapers. They didn't scrape everything. A scraper produces an undulating surface that may give a project a nice handwork character. But that may not be what you want on a tabletop or other surface that sees a lot of raking light. We don't need to be snobs about the tools or process we use. If sanding produces the results that you want, it's fine to use sandpaper. If scraping is a more enjoyable process and you like the textured surface it leaves behind, do some scraping. Don't forget to check out the links below the description for more resources on this subject, and I'll see you next time. This is a Koenigsegg, Sweden's finest sports car. This is a Sjöbergs, Sweden's finest workbench. They are things for people who appreciate quality and high performance, something they can pass down to their grandkids. You can't afford this, but this will cost you less than a good cabinet saw. Check out what Sjöbergs has to offer at the link below this video. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.